Hi, I'm Johan
Hi, I'm Robyn Shepherd.
Hi, I'm Nicolene Low, and welcome to our podcast. We're attorneys practicing as such at Law Incorporated, based in Cape Town, South Africa, where we proudly serve the legal needs of the entrepreneur. In today's session, we are going to be unpacking estate planning. In other words, the convergence of your personal planning decisions and your business efforts, and what that looks like. To get us started, Johan, what is estate planning?
Thanks, Nicolene. Estate planning, there's two things that are certain in life, and and it's a common saying, and that's death and taxes. So you obviously know that that's going to come one day, and it's very helpful if you actually plan for that day. And that's essentially what estate planning is. It's looking at what are your assets, what is your debts, your exposure, your business, and what are the needs of those things when you one day are no longer here. So, that can be in many contexts looked at as how am I going to plan the succession of my business in terms of I am the sole director and I run everything in the business. And one day when I die, what is my family going to do with that business, or the person that I am leaving this business to, how are they going to deal with it? And who is that person going to be? And then also from a tax perspective, it's looking at what is my tax exposure when I do die? Do I have enough free flowing cash in my estate to actually cover that exposure, or are they going to have to sell, as an example, my family home in order to pay that? And these are things that people don't consider when they one day do pass, and they don't do the proper estate planning, like getting their will in order, or looking at other mechanisms through which to hold assets, such as trusts or even companies, is an option in these days. And that's essentially what estate planning is. It's really planning for the future and planning for what is my succession and how is it going to work, and how exactly do I want to structure things in order to make it tax efficient, and also just more efficient in terms of how to administer my estate the day that I do pass. And just so I'm going to kind of pass that on to you then, Robyn, especially when it comes to wills. What exactly are the requirements for a will, and what would happen if one doesn't actually draft a will?
Sure. So the requirements for a valid will is that a person obviously needs to be over the age of 16 years old. The will needs to be in writing, and that means that the will can either be handwritten or it can be typed out. If the will is handwritten, it must be really remembered that the person who writes the will is not allowed to be mentioned as a beneficiary of that specific will. And thirdly, that each page of the will, which includes the last page, must be signed by the testator. The will must also be signed by two competent witnesses, and that person needs to be 14 years of age as well. And if there is no will, then the estate will be wound up in terms of the Intestate Succession Act, which means that the estate will be divided amongst the surviving spouse, the children, the parents, and the siblings, according to the formula found in that act specifically. Nicolene, I'm going to jump to you. Why does everyone need to have a professional drafted will? And is it really all that estate planning is about?
I think I'm going to answer the question twofold. I'm going to start off by saying, I think Johan has really cast the net very widely for us. Estate planning is, there's a saying to say it's not a tick box exercise, it's a lifestyle, right? It's not just a thing we do, it's a mindset change or a mindset shift. And I want to add on to that to say, no, your will is just the culmination of all those structures and efforts that you put in, right? I've often been quoted on calling this process the construction of a house, and the will is really the roof that protects everything below it and everything inside of this house. So it's not just about the will, but the will is a critical component to this. And I think we need to look at this from a human point of view. Estate planning sounds extremely complicated, and for the most part, it really is no simple exercise. But what are we aiming to achieve? It's about legacy. It's about the footprint that you wish to leave on this world. It's about caring enough to realize that your exit from this life leaves a gasping hole in terms of your family and loved ones. And that is difficult by itself without needing to look for where things are or how things were done, and just completely just stepping into an administrative mess, for lack of a better phrase. So it's about wanting to leave your footprint, and it's about, I think, caring enough that you make what is already going to be difficult easier on those people that loved you and shared the journey with you. So why do you need a professional will? Now, I think any of us in the room, we are all attorneys, will say, and I don't think this is contested, professionally drafted wills are head and shoulders above those you could buy for free or get for free or buy on a shop shelf. Yes, those still exist. Those are really dangerous documents because most of us are not trained on all the little things that need to be in it. Robyn, you touched on that every page has to be signed, that you need to be of a certain age. The little additional things that we perhaps do not have time to mention today would be you can't have too large spaces between where you sign and where text ends, because it leaves room for someone to fill something in there. And if that were to happen, then we fight about that first before we get to business. So the point is, it needs to look a certain way, and there are really strong reasons for it. And I feel very strongly about it. So I'll conclude my section before I pass on to say that this is one document that stands out above all other legal documents for one simple reason, and that is any other legal document that becomes contentious, we can go to court on, or we can go to mediation or arbitration and say, but this is what I understood this to mean. This is what I intended, and someone can respond. This is the one document where no one is there to explain. So it needs to be done perfectly correct. There's no room for even the slightest margin of poor drafting or error. And that is why I feel very strongly that it needs to be done by a professional. It doesn't have to be a 20-page document. In fact, I support simplicity. And an experienced practitioner would be able to really draw things together in a very practical way for you. So I think let's leave that there. I'll get carried away if we continue further. Johan, I want to ask you about trusts. People talk about trusts. Many say they are no longer relevant. It's something that used to be, but it's not so anymore. What is your take on that?
You know, there's some truth to it. I mean, trusts used to be a lot more, I guess, useful than they did, but it was purely just from a let's say, not evading but avoiding tax. That's how trusts were used in the past, but that's been put to a stop by SARS for a while now. But trusts are still quite a relevant tool when it comes to estate planning. I mean, ultimately, you have to look at, and the one thing that I would say it generally is used for is, how are you going to secure your assets? So it would be immovable property. Let's say you have an immovable property, it's a family home, it's something that you don't really want to be sold. That's something that I would suggest you look at a family trust for. So essentially you can then place the property in the trust, and you know that the day that you pass, that property doesn't need to be transferred, it's secured, and you can set certain conditions for when that property can be sold. It really gives you a mechanism through which you still have some degree of say over how the assets that you've built up over your lifetime are looked after, are protected. And, trusts can also be used as a funding mechanism, especially when you have small children. Essentially where trusts are used the most in estate planning is to make provision for, should I die and my children are, still minors, then a testamentary trust will be set up in which essentially the money that you've left for your children will be kept and administered by your trustees in order to look after your children. And therefore, trusts, as much as people don't want to use them these days to avoid tax, are still a very useful tool when it comes to wanting to plan your future and the legacy that you leave, and especially in terms of protecting certain things that you want to protect for generations to come, instead of just, passing on to your children and leaving and letting them decide whether they want to sell or not to sell. It really depends on the person, and it's really dependent on what you're trying to achieve. And I mean, there are very tax beneficial ways to use a trust, especially in conjunction with companies and so forth, and how you structure these things can ultimately actually save you a lot of money in the long run. But you have to consult a professional on it. But I would say when it comes to the most practical use of trust in estate planning, it is mainly when it comes to minor children. And I think I'll add that, I'll pass that on to you, Robyn. How exactly would you make provision for your minor children, and especially or your dependents, such as maybe frail parents and so forth? If you could kind of discuss that topic for us a little bit.
Sure. So you've already touched on testamentary trusts with regards to minor children, and that is something that's useful and practical, and definitely, as you've mentioned, speak to a professional about that. But when it comes to estate planning as a whole, when it comes to minor children and dependents, it is also very important to have those somewhat difficult conversations with your family members as well. When it comes to minor children, we need to think about guardianship as well. Who is going to look after the children when you're no longer there? That is something that you also need to make sure that you do have in your will, so that that doesn't become an issue after you have passed, and that doesn't become an extra, traumatic experience for children to go through as well. And then in your estate planning as well, make sure that you have clauses that really deal with the maintenance of your minor children as well. And in terms of, the elderly and your frail parents, you could make clauses that really touch on who in the family is going to look after your parents, where are they going to stay, the terms and conditions that come with that as well, as to avoid that if you are the person that has looked after the children and the frail parents rather, for the significance of your adult life, it makes it a much easier, and I use that word very lightly, it makes it a much easier process then to transition once you have passed, because you have everything already set in stone. So that's how I think we should deal with minor children and the dependents in terms of estate planning. Nicolene, I wanted to, end off with you. Estate planning, we've touched on many different aspects of it. I wanted to ask, what does estate planning practically mean for a business?
From a business point of view, I mean, we have to not lose sight of the fact that there's a clear personal element involving children, dependents, dealing with that, planning that, having those discussions. In fact, if the children are old enough, I do actually think there's value in having a family meeting and discussing these things so that there are no surprises when this event occurs. So I really wanted to add on to that. As for the business, I think at some point that difficult conversation needs to be had, that if something happens unexpectedly or suddenly, that we don't have a situation where no one knows what the future holds. Are we still okay? Should we come to work? Now, I think we should have those practical arrangements in place and say, if this happens, this is what is going to happen, right? And then, of course, to make a decision on, does the business continue? Of course, in some industries like professional services, there are certain rules in relation to the professional body stepping in if it's a sole practitioner. And those things need to be looked at and considered, and how we want to deal with it. Or is it a question of wrapping things up and handing things over, or selling the business? I think that there needs to be some thought and there needs to be communication in relation to that. Obviously a big topic, so I think let's leave it at that for the moment. Thank you for joining us in our session today. We really appreciate it. We know time is always in short supply, so thank you for investing your time with us. If this topic was interesting, or if you have any comments or questions, please pop it into the box below. If you have any suggestions on future topics, please do let us know. And then, of course, please join us for our next episode, where we'll be talking about misrepresentation, or when people basically are dishonest in the undertakings when we make agreements, when something is not quite right, and what do you do about it? So thank you so much.